Hi, this is Nettie American Airlines calling. I am monitoring a call in which Flight 11, the flight attendant is advising our reps that the pilot, everyone's been stabbed.
Nobody moves. Everything will be okay. If you try to make any move, you'll danger yourself and the airplane. Just stay quiet. Nobody moves, please. We are going back to the airport. Don't try to make any stupid moves.
When talking about fundamentalist terrorism, 9/11 and the Bush administration's war on terror are amongst the first things to spring to mind. However, I'd like to unpack this rather freely bandied around concept of fundamentalist terror. After all, it is most definitely pre-existing of the tragic events of September the 11th, 2001. So in this video, we'll look at the history of fundamentalism as a concept in of itself, and explore the developments of this rather misused and somewhat colloquial term. We'll look at the different types of fundamentalism before moving on to the history of terrorism. And throughout this video, I'm going to try and explain why these concepts are seen as being transgressive, and by whom it is viewed by in this manner. Finally, we'll talk about the future of terrorism, and ask ourselves whether this will stem from a fundamentalist standpoint. To start ourselves off, we need to consider a definition of fundamentalism. After all, this is a term commonly bandied around by our media outlets, usually being used to describe branches of Islam. However, does this really give us an understanding of this concept? Let's consider a definition. Fundamentalism can be defined as a religious or political movement characterized by a strict belief in the literal interpretation and strict adherence to a set of religious texts, political manifestos, or manuscripts. Interestingly, this literal interpretation of manuscript emanates from American Protestantism, so right away it is clear that fundamentalism exists outside of radical strains of Islam, very much counter to what our media sources would have us believe. In fact, we can identify fundamentalist leanings within most organised religions. We begin our journey in the early to mid-19th century, during the transition towards modernity. This is a time characterised by industrial revolution and the introduction of progressive thought. This is where we see the first instances of Christian fundamentalism. This form of fundamentalism came about as a response to the newly formed theological liberalism and modernism, these ideas being key in the move to modernity. Fundamentalists argued that the progressive views being introduced were rejecting the key aspects of the Bible. Fundamentalists instead chose to interpret the Bible as being an exact historical description of events that took place, and believed in the second coming of Jesus. So in essence, they saw the Bible as an early type of history book. Religious fundamentalism really begins to build up momentum during the interwar period. Fundamentalist preachers who historically travelled around from city to city, state to state, begin gaining the means to set up designated fundamentalist churches of their own. One of the most notable travellers in this instance being Amy Semple McPherson. McPherson had made a name for herself travelling around preaching fundamentalist Christian teachings. It was not unheard of for one of her sermons to totally saturate the venue she attended with followers. Upon arriving in California, McPherson set about establishing her own brick and mortar church, naming it the Angelus Temple. Sermons and religious events at this church were said to be comparable to that of a Broadway production, with actors and professional costumes being brought in especially. During the latter part of the 20th century, this fundamentalist stance begins to become visible in other religions. In 1979, the pro-West Iranian government was overthrown by an Islamic fundamentalist regime led by Ruhollah Khomeini. This regime is still ruling over the nation to this day, and is one of the first instances of Islamic fundamentalism being observed by the West. However, it is important to note that regimes such as the one in Iran do not class themselves as being fundamentalist, instead viewing themselves as Islamic revivalists. This introduces the interesting debate around the labelling of such groups, but we shall come back to this later on in the video. From this we can explore the idea that both groups see each other as being different, strange, or deviant. The Iranian revolutionaries seeing the Western way of life as being transgressive to their understanding of the teachings of the Quran, and the West identifying the regime as oppressive and therefore transgressive to their norms and values and beliefs. We now begin to see a transition away from a purely religious-based fundamentalism. A highly political level of fundamentalism also exists, which somewhat separates religion out of the equation. This introduces the concept of political fundamentalism, whereby the fundamentalist politics of a group are the driving forces behind its existence. An example of this can be seen as a result of the Good Friday Agreements. This agreement, signed in the early 1990s, signified a ceasefire between the IRA and the British Army, essentially ending the Troubles. However, a small group of fundamentalist nationals did not believe that peaceful coexistence was a plausible reality. This led to a small group of former IRA individuals splitting off, forming a new group, namely the Real IRA. This group upheld the strict belief code of absolutely no relationship with the British imperialists should be allowed. Up until this point, we have focused on the concept of fundamentalism, giving a brief history of and identifying how it has evolved over the past 2 centuries. We shall now turn our attention to the second half of the equation: terrorism. Contemporary terrorism can be said to have developed in 4 waves. Let's explore these waves in turn. The first wave of contemporary terrorism is often referred to as the anarchist wave. This wave was more concerned with assassinations as a strategy, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand being a key example here, which culminated in the outbreak of the First World War. This wave of terror was not so much about being transgressive, rather as a tactic in achieving a goal. The second wave, referred to as the nationalist or anti-colonialist wave, is regarded as being sparked by the Treaty of Versailles, although it didn't really gain much momentum until post-World War II and the process of decolonisation which was to follow. In this instance, the Western colonies were very much seen as being the enemy who needed to be evicted from their former colonies. The natives often turned to guerrilla-style tactics, drawing upon national heroes in order to gain their sovereignty. One of the most infamous examples in this case being the tactics used by the Indochines, what we would now refer to as Vietnamese, in the fight against the French for independence during the 1946-54 Indochine War. Other examples in this field include India and Pakistan's fight for independence in 1947, Burma in 1948, Libya in 1951, and Ghana in 1957. In these cases, it became possible for the first time to transgress en masse against the imperialist superpowers, an act which before the Second World War would have simply been unimaginable. This mass transgression of native populations arguably was one of the key factors in bringing about revolt that would ultimately lead to decolonisation and political change. The third wave, or New Left wave, is the beginning of what we would recognise as terrorism in the 21st century. This wave is characterised by strategies such as hijackings, hostage-taking and kidnappings, to name a few. One such example of this being the Dawson's Field hijacking, where 3 passenger jets, a Swissair DC-8, a TWA 707 and a BOAC VC-10 were hijacked and forced to land on a remote desert airstrip in Jordan by a group known as the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. This was as a result of European nations imprisoning a number of Palestinian sympathisers. This wave of terror also introduces the concept of transnational collaboration between groups, for example the West German Red Army. In this instance, terrorism itself begins to transgress the boundaries of an individual nation-state. It's important to note that this form of terrorism is often very much driven by political fundamentalism, with the aforementioned IRA fitting into this category of terrorist group. Finally, the fourth wave, or religious wave, of terrorism sees religion as the basis to the successful organisation of a state. This is where we can clearly tie religious fundamentalism and terrorism for the first time. Groups such as the Taliban, ISIS, Al-Qaeda and Boko Haram are some notable examples of organisations labelled as religious extremist terrorist groups. Such groups are labelled as alien, different and transgressive in the West. They don't follow our norms and values, people view them as deviant. A very good contemporary example in this instance being the case against Shamar Begum. So, how have terrorism and fundamentalism become linked? One explanation would be that the terrorist, insurgent tactics have become a necessity for groups such as the Taliban fighting the far more technically advanced West. Traditional combat strategy just won't work when you have American spy satellites, drones, and general electronic warfare pitted against you. This situation is further outlined during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan during the 1980s, where a relatively ill-equipped guerrilla force, the Mujahideen, were able to hold off the might of the Soviet Union with relative ease. The Mujahideen, of course, being the predecessors of the Taliban. It's all linked. From this, we can begin to understand why groups we class in the West as being fundamentalist may turn to terror. It is also important to think about the sociology behind what being labelled as a terrorist means, and to ask ourselves why we label as such. What actually is the difference between a terrorist and a freedom fighter? I would argue that in reality the sole difference is the label applied to the group. For example, post 9/11, President Bush made the now infamous comment,
"Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists,"
implying that if you're not on the side of the US, then you must be a terrorist. But while 9/11 was clearly an act of terror, why isn't the indiscriminate bombings of Pakistan by US drones also classed as an act of terror? After all, the same violations of international law are being made, including the violation of Pakistani sovereignty and illegal killing of civilians. We can understand this situation through Becker's discussion about moral entrepreneurs, the only difference between the US and the fundamentalist terrorist being that the US is in a position of power. As a result, these groups get labelled as being transgressive, a label which has the effect of wrongly alienating the entire culture, creating a radical other and legitimising violence against them. To finish off, we will briefly explore what the future of fundamentalist terror has in store. IR scholars have identified a potential fifth wave of terror, a wave that is truly transnational and knows no national boundaries. This wave of terror is mostly concerned with computer hacking and disruption. We have already seen a couple of examples of this, such as the alleged North Korean state hacking of the US film industry. While this was not an example of a fundamentalist terror attack, it does raise the question of what will happen when fundamentalist terror groups begin using technology more effectively. After all, the individual will no longer be needed to have a physical presence in the area they are attacking. To add to this, it is important to consider how technology may change people's perceptions of groups that are currently classed as being terrorist. Current popular thought is that these groups are very much the deviant who need to be protected against. But could the increase in social media and vastly more capable internet connectivity, as Elon Musk's new Starlink network will provide, change public perception of these groups, making them seem less transgressive as a result of increased exposure to fundamentalist propaganda?